Welcome to this panel on Techno-Geopolitics and security. First, I would like to thank the Institut d'Estudis Nord-Americans and the rest of the partners for organizing this great event. Also, I would like to thank the three excellent experts we have in this panel. The topic we're discussing today, technology, geopolitics, and security, is clearly a hot issue nowadays. The US and China have been in a technological competition for years, while the European Union has struggled to find its own space. With the new Trump administration, many of the agreements between the US and the EU are looking shaky. These past years, over the different meetings at the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, there have been areas of contention, like industrial policy and the US Inflation Reduction Act, EU digital regulations such as the DSA and DMA, and data privacy. But at least there was room for debate and finding common ground. Now, both the Trump administration and big names in Silicon Valley have directly attacked the EU digital model, accusing it of censorship and unfairly punishing American firms. It seems that the spaces for cooperation and dialogue are decreasing, while the EU's role in global technology looks less relevant. Meanwhile, we are experiencing US-China technological competition, the war in Ukraine, and potential EU reforms that will impact the future of technology and innovation. For discussing about this critical moment, we have with us three excellent experts. Dimitri Lorenzani, member of the Competitiveness Task Force of the Secretariat General of the European Commission. He's also a visiting professor at the College of Europe. Thank you for being here. We also have with us Lindsay Gorman, Managing Director and Senior Fellow of the GMF's Technology Program. She has served in the Biden White House as a Senior Advisor on Emerging Technology, National Security, and Democracy issues. Thank you for being here. And last but not least, we have Sofia Romansky, a strategic analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. She's also the project coordinator for the Global Commission on Responsible AI in the military domain. So, first I would like to ask the three of you about the current state of the US-EU cooperation on technology. What do you see as the main challenges and opportunities for cooperation between the US and the EU under the new Trump administration? And what major changes should we expect? Dimitri, you can start.
Thank you very much, Javier, for this generous introduction. Thank you for the invitation to the organizers, dear Manuel. It's a pleasure, an honor to be here in La Pedrera, in this city that is very close to my heart. And I will use these few minutes for these opening remarks to give you a little bit of an idea of how competitiveness, and in particular, with a focus on technology and innovation-based productivity, has become a North Star of the action of this new commission. This is the von der Leyen II mandate, but it's also the second Trump administration, and therefore it's important to understand how political priorities are changing in a context of a complex international and geopolitical environment. But let's start from the facts. I think we all know, we all understand that for 2 decades, at least since Europe missed out on the first digital revolution led by the internet, the European economy has been losing ground vis-à-vis other geo-blocs, and this despite quite unquestionable assets like talent, like a big single market, like a unique social market economy. For instance, if you take real GDP per capita, you see that the gap between Europe and the US has doubled over the past 20 years, and China has clearly overtaken Europe. Now, what are the reasons for this? Here, I think I would like to refer to the analysis put forward by Professor Mario Draghi in his report on the future of European competitiveness of September 2024. It's a quite sobering analysis that points clearly the finger towards a long-standing gap in productivity growth between Europe and other geo-blocs. And what is the reason? Well, the most important reason, according to the report, is that in Europe it is harder to translate innovative ideas and the quite rich talent of knowledge, pool of ideas into marketable technologies, and to infuse and integrate innovations and new technologies into lead mature sectors and existing business models. If you also look at the latest seminal analysis by the European Commission, especially the GRTD, it is quite clear that with regard to innovation in many future technologies, especially digital one, the US is often ahead of Europe, ahead of the European Union, and China has been catching up in many high growth sectors. The experts talk about a middle technology trap. It is basically a vicious circle of prevalence of traditional industrial sectors or lack of industrial dynamism, low investments, especially in intangibles, and therefore low innovation, and as a result, sluggish growth. Now, at the end of January, the European Commission has not left this analysis by Draghi report in the drawer, but has owned this analysis, has made it its own through the Competitiveness Compass. It was adopted on the 29th of January, and it is the first major initiative of this new Commission. The idea is to set a direction of travel for the coming 5 years and a roadmap of concrete policy actions to restore Europe's competitiveness. And of course, this happens along 3 pillars, 3 transformational imperatives that are also based on the Draghi report. And based on what I've said, you will not be surprised that the first pillar is closing the innovation gap in Europe vis-à-vis the US, vis-à-vis China, vis-à-vis other geoblocks, reactivating a virtuous innovation flywheel of capital, of knowledge, of talent, to avoid that Europe is stuck in the slow lane of this global race for technological primacy and of competitiveness. This has led to some concrete actions, a sort of menu of flagship initiatives for the next years. I will just tell you a few. For instance, a 28 regime for innovative companies. For instance, cutting-edge initiatives to boost AI and transform Europe into an AI continent. And a strategy for startups and scale-ups that will lead also to some regulatory changes, the so-called European Innovation Act. I mean, of course, this is not the only problem that Europe has. There are also other factors that are identified in the Draghi report. The second one is other structural barriers that hamper the competitiveness of European companies vis-à-vis international competitors. One is high energy prices. They are still 2 to 3 times higher in Europe than in the US if we look at electricity. And here the Commission puts forward for this second pillar, a joint plan for decarbonization and competitiveness, and it was only yesterday that a major flagship initiative was adopted. You all have heard of it, the Clean Industrial Deal, which is a plan for clean technologies and energy-intensive industries in Europe. But I will not linger too much on this second pillar, but I want to linger on the third one, which I think is very important. The third pillar is reducing excessive dependencies and increasing security. I think the colleagues who have just spoken have highlighted this aspect as important in a context of a geopolitical environment in which literally anything can be weaponized. It is increasingly harder for European producers, for European companies, but also for other companies throughout the world to be increasingly dependent on few third countries for key strategic inputs like semiconductors, like critical raw materials. And here the plan of the Commission is, as put forward in the Competitiveness Compass, to diversify supply chains in order to secure them, but also to boost open strategic autonomy. Think, for instance, as it was announced in the revision of the public procurement in 2026, to think of other criteria, European preference in critical sectors and technologies, so very important for what we are discussing today. And to conclude, let me say also that the Competitiveness Compass, in addition to these 3 pillars, also introduces a new way of working together, which I think is very closely linked to this idea of challenges and opportunities of the technological revolution. This is across 5 horizontal enablers for competitiveness, but I would like just to highlight 2 that I think are important. The first one is coordination, better coordination between EU and national policies, but also between Europe and others. For instance, the Compass introduces the idea of a competitiveness coordination tool that will allow us to better align research, technology, and industrial policies and investments at national and EU level around projects of common European interest, of projects that are European public goods, and better use a more rationalized European budget. You have all heard about the discussions on a competitiveness fund, and better crowding in of private investment. Why is this important? Well, you can imagine the potential that this has for technologies, and in fact, we are starting to pilot this new competitiveness coordination tool in some areas, and one of them is advanced AI vertical use cases. And finally, I want to stress the second enabler, which is a radical simplification effort. The Commission has committed to achieve its goals, including in the field of technology and innovation, in the least burdensome way, and has set a target to reduce administrative burden by 25% for all companies and 35% for SMEs via a series of omnibus packages, simplification packages. One was adopted yesterday in the area of sustainable finance and investments. I will not go into the details, but the savings are estimated in the order of 6 billion euros, additional investments 50 billion euros, therefore it's a big opportunity also for technologies. All this to conclude, to say that I believe that the competitiveness compass in this new geopolitical context shows the awareness by the Commission to be more committed than ever to seize the opportunities and tackle the challenges of technologies and innovation to sail towards this new North Star of competitiveness and sustainable prosperity. It is also very clearly aware that competitiveness is not only the responsibility of the Commission, it is a joint endeavor. And there is a clear call for all institutions, all member states, third partners, the private sector, to put all hands on deck and work together to avoid what Mario Draghi called the slow agony of Europe, and somehow to rekindle and revive the European animal spirits, the European entrepreneurship towards tech sovereignty and competitiveness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and delighted to follow such excellent remarks, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Javier. Thank you to the U.S. Consulate, to the organizers. It's great to be here today, and I'd like to focus my remarks on discussing really three key trends when we talk about challenges and opportunities with the new administration. I'd like to start by thinking back where we were in the first Trump administration and what's really changed in the technological landscape, both geopolitically and as well as technologically, from 8 years ago to today. And so I would like to focus on three key ideas. The first is that this decisive decade of technological innovation that we predicted 8 years ago is already very much underway. The innovators, the countries that are developing and are on the front lines of technological revolution and innovations, from artificial intelligence to quantum information to biotechnology, electric vehicles, are increasingly dominating national power and obtaining geopolitical control. But the technologies are advancing themselves too, and over the next few years and the next decade, we're also going to see a shift from consumer applications, particularly in artificial intelligence, to industrial applications. I'll give just a couple examples. In a recent study from just the last year, farmers in India decided to use AI tools, chatbots to prompt them about soil testing, testing tools using artificial intelligence about the quality of their soil and their crops, and without any increased inputs and actually decreased consumption of resources, these farmers in this small pilot project in a rural area of India increased their outputs by 21% just by using a couple of AI tools. In the field of medicine, another study found this year that for diagnosing complex disease conditions, they tested clinicians, a clinician and AI team, and AI itself in trying to diagnose these rare and complicated diseases. And not only did the AI outperform the clinicians alone, but the AI actually also outperformed the clinician and AI teams. If we don't think that this is going to revolutionize the future of medicine and healthcare, we're fooling ourselves. And which countries develop these new technologies and capitalize on them and build them will succeed in this great power competition. we're in a different place from where we were 8 years ago. The race is very much on. And so the second trend I'd like to highlight is that from the point of view of liberal democracies, which I think the Transatlantic Alliance is very much a bulwark of, and why it's so important that the US and the EU come together and navigate these challenges and capitalize on these opportunities around competitiveness in a values-forward way, is that autocrats are advancing as well. 10 years ago, the People's Republic of China, the PRC, issued a signature industrial strategy plan, Made in China 2025. And the goal of that plan, released in 2015, was to transform China from a low-cost manufacturing base for producing goods into a high-tech superpower. It identified 10 critical industry areas, from new innovations in computing and IT infrastructure, artificial intelligence, to biotechnology, to electric vehicles and new energy storage. And it said China would like to be the leader of the world in these 10 critical areas. It also introduced a number of means to get there. Industrialization policies, the ability for academics to do research on technical standards, involvement in international organizations to promote PRC-based technologies, often to the detriment of their Western and also Indo-Pacific competitors. Today we're in 2025, and China has succeeded immensely in those goals. Across these technology areas, it is either a leader or near leader in almost all of them. And in the ones it is not, it is quickly catching up. We are in a much different place. And I would add that the Made in China 2025 plan was actually based on a German industry plan, the German Industry 4.0 plan. The PRC leaders, the CCP leaders, so admired what Europe was doing and planning to do on industrialization and competitiveness that it used those same techniques and ideas to catapult forward over the last decade. So we're in a very different place now from when the first Trump administration took office, where these ideas were theoretical. I think there was a theoretical warning that this might happen. Today, we're confronting a new reality, and I think that requires a new urgency. And so I'm heartened to see that Europe is starting to really think seriously about its own competitiveness. And just as autocrats like China are advancing on technology areas, so too is the increasing cooperation between China and Russia. There's a lot of discussion about how China and Russia are increasingly cooperating with their No Limits partnership, announced a couple of years ago. On the battlefield, China's involvement and attempted involvement in the Ukraine war. But what's less discussed is that in the technological realm, they're also increasing cooperation. The China-Russia Investment Fund has seeded some of Russia's leading biotechnology companies. And China is using engineers and resources to build out its own competitiveness in partnership with Russia. Why is this concerning? In addition to the increasing geopolitical ties, Russia also has history of bioweapons. And so these are trends that we ignore at our own peril. China now, the People's Republic of China, has more DNA collected on American citizens than probably any actor in the United States itself. And that's very concerning from a privacy perspective. I certainly am concerned about that. But even more, it's concerning from a competitiveness perspective, because going back to these questions about the decisive decade, with AI as an enabling technology for biotechnology innovations, the drivers of production are talent, compute, semiconductors, but also data. And China is collecting this data. The third key trend where I think we're in a different place entering this second Trump administration than the first is the geopolitical dynamics have shifted about China as a competitor itself. 8 years ago, there was a dawning recognition in Washington that China posed a strategic threat to the United States' technological competitiveness and that of our allies and partners. Today, Europe has also begun to wake up to that threat. Under the leadership of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, there have been de-risking strategies and a real need to look at critical and emerging technologies in the context of export controls, in the context of outbound investment screening regimes, and there have been policies coming out of the EU to do just that. But I would urge that this consensus, this budding consensus that we have today on China that we didn't have 8 years ago, is a fragile one. And that comes from both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that one of the real values of exchanges like this one are to remind ourselves that this is all about political will, and that the two sides are reacting to each other as well. Even in her recent remarks, Ursula von der Leyen, who has been an amazing partner in the technological contest and an amazing partner to the United States, especially in the last administration, started maybe even to walk back some of this rhetoric and to indicate that Europe will not be caught having a trade war with two sides. On the other hand, you have efforts, a new incoming chancellor in Germany who's taken perhaps a more aggressive tone towards China. And even as Germany has moved along and recognized this threat, publishing a China strategy 2 years ago with emphasis on technology, it still has failed to implement some of the policies around 5G and 6G that would set its tone for competitiveness. Similarly, in the United States, there are questions about whether this posture that the Republican Party has so championed, this aggressive stance to China, which so many of the president's advisors hold, will indeed become the China strategy of this new administration. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. It's wonderful to see Europe gain its own 2 feet when it comes to competitiveness. The United States should support those efforts and should support opportunities for concrete engagement and concrete development of joint technology initiatives moving forward, remembering that there are threats out there and they are going to be running faster regardless of our actions. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for the organizers for inviting me to this meeting today, also to my fellow panelists for giving such excellent introductions to 2 very important perspectives in this conversation. Coming from a research perspective and perhaps a more academic angle, I believe that for the sake of dialogues such as these and common understanding, as mentioned in Javier's opening speech, it is essential to always also take a few steps back and think about the subjects that we are actually talking about at the most rudimentary and basic level. Specifically, I would like to focus on the buzzword that has been around for at least the last 3 years, which is artificial intelligence, and understanding exactly why artificial intelligence has taken the center stage in these discussions, as well as the term geopolitics, what it means and what the implications are for both the challenges and opportunities that have been mentioned by the panelists already. And specifically, emphasizing that the challenges that are faced on both sides of the Atlantic are the same, and consequently finding ways to cooperate on ways to mitigate the risks while maximizing the benefits of technologies like artificial intelligence is going to be paramount in the coming years. So, why the focus on artificial intelligence? Why is it the big thing right now? I would primarily attribute it to 4 reasons that have also already, in part at least, been mentioned by the panelists before me. The first is that we are living in what can be referred to as the post-2018 generative AI revolution. Artificial intelligence is by no means a new technology. It has been around for decades. It has faced both winters and summers and springs and blooms and busts. But with the advance of generative artificial intelligence, I'm sure that all of you are thinking about ChatGPT, for example, we are facing a new kind of technology that has the potential to touch all aspects of our lives. and is more seamlessly becoming integrated into our everyday reality. At the same time, we face a second reason. We are facing continuous advances in semiconductor technologies, the hardware, the compute mentioned by Lindsay, which is the foundation of all emerging and disruptive technologies that we are looking at now. We are almost at the point of breaking physics with just how small these computer chips are getting. But they are also becoming more specialized and efficient in the way that they process information. Most importantly, however, for the geopolitical context, is that the supply chains of these microscopic parts are immensely diversified, from the Indo-Pacific with key actors such as South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, to Europe with companies such as ASML in the Netherlands, and to, of course, the US, which is an innovator in design and development. This leads me to my third point of why AI has gotten to the forefront in geopolitics, because it has become both the subject and the object of great power competition, as mentioned by all three speakers before me. We are indeed in a kind of arms race, where the realization is that the states who will be the first to develop key technologies will be the ones who reap the benefits first, but also will be able to then impose certain guidances or regulations upon others. We saw this with the breaking news around DeepSeek, where the assumption of the primacy of American large language models was suddenly undermined, where the question was, how was it possible for China to approximate, it's not an exact equivalent, but still approximate the advances achieved by the US with far inferior semiconductor components? And of course, the story is a lot more complicated, and I encourage all of you to read into it exactly how DeepSeek was developed, but it is a key question to ask. And finally, what we are also seeing is now artificial intelligence is not just some kind of speculation of a future science fiction future, but it really is part of our reality. A recent study showed that at least 70% of students in the European Union have used ChatGPT for their university assignments. But also beyond the average person, we are also at the moment seeing the integration of artificial intelligence into real battlefields. And that is part of a large part of what my work focuses on again. From Ukraine to Gaza, we are seeing how artificial intelligence can have an effect on the military domain. And hence, it is also even more important for the geopolitics of emerging technologies, because artificial intelligence is a means for which conflict can also be enacted as well as resolved. That's part of the point that often is not emphasized sufficiently. Artificial intelligence offers key advantages for the speed, scale, and reach of many activities from the civilian to the military domains. But it also creates many challenges for regulation, governance being one of the biggest areas in which challengers are faced. For example, we need to be conscious of the fact that most advances in artificial intelligence are currently taking place in the private sector. As such, there is not so much government oversight within the development of the development and the innovation processes. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but if these technologies are to be integrated into the military domain, then it is necessary to know what components went into them. At the same time, there are a variety of actors who are concerned with where these technologies are coming from in terms of supply chains, how to ensure that the supply chains are secure, as mentioned by Dimitri, and how to ensure that while being part of a supply chain, you're also not creating strategic vulnerabilities for states. Fortunately, things are not entirely bleak. From the national to the regional to the global governance perspectives. There are a number of initiatives on civilian and military AI that are attempting to answer these questions and look towards both safety and security when integrating AI into our practices. Just to name a few which have been important and especially key in the last year, the US-China dialogues on military AI have shown that there is still a potential for common ground between two states that come from very different semantic and cultural backgrounds, but still understand the severity of implications of integrating, for example, autonomous weapon systems into their militaries. Of course, the EU AI Act, while being explicitly focused on the civilian domain, also acknowledges how artificial intelligence is an inherently dual-use technology, meaning that we cannot just say that one technology that was, for example, developed for the military domain, once it reaches the civilian domain, will remain unregulated. It plays into this complicated dynamic. And other initiatives like the ones that I am a part of, the Global Commission on Responsible AI in the Military Domain, is really trying to be a multi-stakeholder initiative that engages the entire world and recognizes that technologies like artificial intelligence require many different minds at work in order to ensure that we can use them in a way which minimizes the risks while maximizing the benefits. As such, for the rest of this dialogue and also for this day, I encourage you to keep all of this background context in mind as we think about, as we ask ourselves genuine questions about what we want to achieve, both on both sides of the Atlantic, but also with these very important technologies. Thank you so much for your attention.
So, Lindsay, I think it will be really useful for the audience if you could summarize Biden's technological strategy towards China over the past few years. What were its successes and failures? And lastly, do you see Trump following or breaking this strategy?
Very much the question of the day. Perfect. Okay. Very much the question of the day. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for asking, and great to hear the wonderful remarks. I think the Biden administration's strategy on technology to China really had three key dimensions. There was the promote, the protect, and the partner. And it's actually very similar to the first Trump administration, who also outlined that framework. But where it really took a departure was in a couple of realizations. First, I think the Biden administration cemented this idea that the old economic order of the 90s was really over. And I think, as Jake Sullivan said, that it's not coming back. In the 90s, we thought we could just engage with China economically, develop technologies, develop ideas, exchange freely, without any geopolitical consequences, without consequences to US competitiveness. And the Biden administration's strategy recognized that that was no longer tenable. And it also, on technology, created a shift from an attitude which said, we are going to keep China a generation or two behind and make sure that the United States is a generation or two ahead on the leading edge technologies, particularly with semiconductors, and shifted that from this one or two generations behind to creating as large a lead as possible. And that was the birth of these export controls on semiconductors of October of 2022. And the increase that and follow-on regulations that we've seen around data brokers and data security, and now electric vehicles as well. So I think those are sort of maybe the two key shifts. But the partner piece of the strategy is where I think there has been a lot of work done, maybe some successes, some failures. I was one of the original architects of the Trade and Technology Council when I was in government. And I'll be honest and say, I think in some places, we did succeed in building some of the bridges, figuring out who in this 27-member European Union we should really be partnering with, and designing some ideas on what technological governance and innovation should look like in democracies, denouncing, for example, social scoring, which now the EU AI Act also prohibits, and creating channels for engagement, for example, on international standards organizations. Before the last 4 years, many of the key international standards organizations, and in particular the International Telecommunications Union, were being increasingly dominated by China, government as well as scientists. And as part of the TTC, the US and the EU, set up these contact groups to say, we are going to study in key technology areas like AI and like quantum, what's happening in these standards bodies and where do they come up against our democratic values. So some small successes, the discussion of AI risk management frameworks. I think in the trade side, perhaps it didn't work quite as well. And also I think we need to go farther into really concrete implementation projects. For example, setting up a US-EU public AI infrastructure, maybe a public cloud. I would like to see more joint projects, and I think we didn't do enough there. But I think, moving into the next administration, it's going to be increasingly vital to continue to partner, not as a matter of this is how we've always done it, but because it's in the United States' self-interest, both because we can't control all the chips in the world going to China just on our own. Some of the major companies developing them are not American. And there, I think it's going to be critical that we cement those relationships and we are able to keep working with our allies and partners. And so that I see as a potential difference, but I hope one that organizations and events like this can really overcome.
Thank you. Sofia, let's move to a different topic. Over the past few years, the war in Ukraine has been a testing ground for the deployment of new technologies in warfare, both on the battlefield and in shaping public discourse and mood. So my question is, what do you think we have learned about the future of war and technology after 3 years of war in Ukraine?
I think that's a very valuable question, also based on what I mentioned as the fourth geopolitical dimension of artificial intelligence and emerging technologies, and that is that we are now seeing live laboratories where these technologies are not only being fielded but developed at the same time, and where there's this constant back and forth where certain needs are seen and then solutions are created practically on the spot. And so what we are seeing is that the nature of war remains the same, but the character of war is changing, where speed and scale are really going to be the determining factors in wars of the future. But it's not changing necessarily in the exact regards that we would have expected from science fiction books, where people remain important, but they become important in different ways. And I think one of the most important lessons that we can draw from the war in Ukraine is the value of data. So for a little bit of a military crash course, a concept that is absolutely essential within the military domain and also within the execution of operations is the so-called OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, act loop. In order to win any confrontation or conflict overall, the ultimate goal is that your OODA loop goes faster than that of your opponent. If you're able to navigate your environment and respond to circumstances as well as make decisions faster, then you are more likely to also be superior in battle. What we are seeing is that artificial intelligence has the potential to affect all stages of the OODA loop. We are witnessing the use of drones in order to gather information on the battlefield in Ukraine by identifying Russian vehicles. The Russians are doing the same with sending out small drones. We are also seeing certain degrees of autonomy within systems while this is happening. But in, for example, in Gaza, meanwhile, uses of the IDF, we are seeing decision-making support systems, the fabled Lavender and Where's Daddy, being systems that can provide recommendations for next steps for soldiers. But what binds all of these implementations of artificial intelligence is the data, the ability to collect and process massive amounts of data at the same time, which is far beyond human capabilities, and as such, creating a much more dynamic battlefield in which humans simply cannot operate on their own anymore. And so then we also need to think about how do we then integrate this so-called human-machine teaming and make sure that humans can still remain responsible for the decisions that are made and the outcomes while benefiting from the advantages and the strengths of artificial intelligence. So the takeaway is data will only be more important, and there's still a lot that we need to really understand.
Thank you. So Dimitri, let's talk about the future of Europe. Two key concepts in the EU debate over the past few years have been competitiveness and technological sovereignty. We've also been discussing promoting innovation while reducing geopolitical and economic risks. But there are clearly trade-offs between these policies. So my question is, how can we find a balance between competitiveness and technological sovereignty, and how manage the trade-offs between innovation and de-risking?
Thank you. No, I mean, it's an important point. It's a bit where the discussion is going these days. First of all, it allows me to clarify maybe some points that I touched upon very briefly during my opening remarks. So let me start from the idea that according to the competitiveness compass, technological sovereignty and competitiveness are not a trade-off in itself. Actually, they are simultaneous, consistent, and self-reinforcing goals. I briefly explained how this closing the innovation gap is this first transformational imperative, this pillar number one in order to achieve competitiveness and sustainable prosperity. What does it mean concretely and why it is not in opposition? It means creating the conditions for future technologies to thrive and for Europe to be at the forefront of innovations in sectors that will matter in tomorrow's economy. The question is maybe rather, what are these sectors? What are these technologies? And here, a point that is very close to my heart is the issue of technological foresight, technological horizon scanning. Can we identify these technologies and these sectors, and what should we invest on based on our existing and prospective capacities and needs? It's not an easy answer to give. The compass, the competitiveness compass, includes, I would say, quite an obvious open list of technologies. You will not be surprised: artificial intelligence, advanced semiconductors, quantum. Maybe there quantum is the next somehow trailblazing technology. Here the jury is a little bit out about who will have the first hand in this technology, because, for instance, Europe has significant patenting activities in this area, significant skills. So here somehow competition is still on. Now, what brings together these two concepts of technological sovereignty, of competitiveness, is the idea of innovation-based productivity. What does this mean concretely? That imagine Europe, in a continent where population is declining, we cannot count on rising labor input in order to increase our output growth. And therefore, the solution is to increase productivity. And how? Well, we should push Europe towards the innovation frontier, towards increasing skills, rather than other old-fashioned recipes like restraining wages. The point is also how to do this. Is this easy to do? Well, definitely not. There are certainly important trade-offs to take into account, and a very classic trade-off is actually something that you mentioned. It's this trade-off between the principle of innovation and the principle of precaution. It applies everywhere, but the first place where it applies is regulation, and especially tech regulation. This was a major point in the Draghi report, which highlighted in particular that barriers, regulatory barriers, especially to scale up, are incredibly onerous in the tech sector. And the idea of the Draghi report is that regulation in Europe has been so far, tech regulation in Europe has been largely tilted towards the principle of precaution. What does it mean? Introducing rules and constraints ex ante in order to avert negative consequences ex post, especially for consumers. Now, the compass takes a positive view, says, of course, this has allowed Europe to lead the way in creating a secure regulatory framework for companies to develop and operate these technologies in the single market. And we all know this concept of normative superpower. This has somehow shaped the debate and the global standards. For instance, AI Act, the Data Governance Act, the Cyber Resilience Act, you name them. However, there is also the other side of the coin. I think there is an implicit recognition that in Europe, we should also look a little bit more at what other partners are doing and shift more towards the principle of innovation, including in our regulation. This means enabling more our tech talent, enabling more our technological sector, enabling more our industry to reap the gains from technology. And here, the best example is what my illustrious colleagues have just mentioned, is AI. Here, we all have in mind the seminal AI Act, which is, of course, recognized as the first comprehensive framework for AI in the world. But what the compass does is to announce the next step. The competitiveness compass says, okay, now we have introduced a principle of precaution that is very strong and has influenced the global debate, which is the AI Act. Now we want to move to the principle of innovation through the AI continent package.
And what is this about? Well, the AI continent package has the idea to create all the various conditions, the enabling conditions for Europe to achieve AI leadership, to become this AI continent in line with the AI Act, in line with the responsible AI that we have dreamt of through the AI regulation. Now, specific example is the AI Factories and Invest AI initiative. What does it mean? Leverage Europe supercomputing power, and I'm happy to say this because we are in Barcelona, where we have one of the most important supercomputers in Europe. These are top class in the world. We want to exploit them more and open them to researchers, open them to companies, open them to startups in order to train and develop AI models that can then be used in the industry through the so-called vertical AI use cases. And you have all heard recently the President von der Leyen announced a new initiative called Invest AI. It's 200 billion euros of public and private investments to develop the first ever AI gigafactories on the European soil in order to train very large models. So I think these initiatives show how these trade-offs exist, but they can be overcome in order to achieve and seize these opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Lindsay, let's go back to the US now. One political trend that we have seen from Europe that has surprised many people is Silicon Valley's sudden shift to the right. So for many decades, Silicon Valley was seen as neoliberal in economic terms, but progressive in social terms. But now we see not only Elon Musk, but also Mark Zuckerberg changing their discourse and aligning with Trump. So can you help us make sense of this change, and what are the reasons behind it?
I think in one sense, there's a simplistic answer, which is that these are business leaders. They are following the political winds. That I think, if the current president had not been elected, we would not have seen such a rapid shift. So on one hand, it's recognizing that there's someone new in power, with a very clear set of goals and visions on a deregulatory agenda, which is something that's actually been in line with what many of these companies in Silicon Valley perhaps would have wanted many years ago. It was only 7 or 8 years ago that Washington started to think, well, we need to actually regulate and do something about the tech companies, about this unchecked Silicon Valley innovation. These trade-offs. Move fast and break things means that, yes, you move fast, but you also can break things. And in the US, we saw some of that breaking happen in democracy and social media. And it was a recognition then that when we developed these technologies originally, when Silicon Valley, as you mentioned, this sort of maybe more progressive, democratic-minded spirit that really animated Silicon Valley in the earlier days. I think in Washington, there was a sense that these technologies would be inherently good for democracy, inherently connective. We saw the Arab Spring. We saw protest movements being boosted by the ability to connect more people and have more free speech. But it was a naive view. And I think what we're seeing today is a little bit of the backlash against that naive view, that in reality, the seeds of autocratic control were actually planted in the early 90s. We thought that these technologies would just democratize everywhere. But in fact, China was building the Great Firewall as early as the early 90s. Russia was honing its tools at disinformation and information operations, combining cyber operations with information operations in a way that in the West we haven't really done. We tend to think of them as separate. Cybersecurity, securing your networks from attacks, and then the information conversation as a separate thing. Russia started honing its strategies there. Now China is learning from what Russia's doing. Our buzzword of the day, AI, is now also complicating that picture with deep fakes, it's becoming increasingly difficult to determine, not just in textual contexts, but in images and video, what's real. A lot of the work that my program does is also studying and tracking deep fakes over the last year in electoral contexts. And we found over a third of elections this last year had major deepfake campaigns associated with them. And so I think the rightward turn to Silicon Valley is almost a reaction also to this idea that the attempt to maybe do something about these festering problems hasn't really succeeded. You know, in the US, we never got federal privacy legislation. We, despite frustrations with social media on both sides of the political aisle, we never really got anywhere. Well, there was a spur of movement on the Kids Online Safety Act over the last year. That also didn't go anywhere. So these tech companies were trying, I think, to appeal to a Washington and to be good actors, to a Washington that felt something needs to be done, that this idea that we could just let unfettered development, moving fast and breaking things, just continue, needs to be addressed. It wasn't addressed. And so it almost feels like the clock has run out a bit on that. And now we're seeing, I think, this movement and this turn towards really what Silicon Valley was built on. Not really paying attention to too many rules and saying, let's ask forgiveness later. And there's a lot of innovation that can come of that, but also some of the consequences that I think we're seeing. So yes, I think part of it is opportunism for sure, but I think it also speaks to some of the sort of the deeper tensions within technology and democracies and security.
Thank you. Sofia, let's move to one of your area of expertise, disinformation. So this is one critical technology that has been deployed, like in the war and in the battlegrounds now. We've been rightly concerned about Russia spreading disinformation and interfering in European affairs these past years. However, in Europe, in recent months, we've seen Elon Musk deploying disinformation strategies against European countries. And some EU politicians have even talked about political interference. So my question is, how can we tackle disinformation when it comes from a country that is an EU ally?
I think to answer that question, Lindsay already gave an excellent introduction for kind of what the scene currently looks like with tech companies from the US and also the dynamics that we are witnessing. But I think my answer will focus mostly on the fact that it's not just about the technologies, it's actually mostly about the people and how people are responding to and interacting with these technologies. So for example, our perception of artificial intelligence as this big, all-touching thing is good, but it's also dangerous in some regards because we also have perhaps too quickly accepted it as a given without thinking about exactly what it is. Think about the way that ChatGPT works. It's very easy to attribute thinking and understanding and recommending these very human qualities to it, when in fact it is just a probability machine. And realizing that that also potentially contributes to hallucinations or more accurately algorithmic bias forces us to reconsider really like what are these technologies doing for us at the moment. And so for me, the issue between tech and democracy is more about people's, or at least perhaps in Europe and the US, loss of trust in democracy and what democracy stands for, and also increasing unwillingness, I would say. I think maybe it's a bit of a strong word, but just kind of, loss, I think, of wanting to think critically about where the world is heading, what we are doing, what we are using technologies for. And so then that's what primarily creates these vulnerabilities to disinformation, misinformation as well, because, well, think about it. If you are used to scrolling platforms like Instagram or TikTok, then you're going to most likely scroll and give the same amount of seconds to any piece of information without any concrete incentives to look any further, to fact check, to think about, well, was this actually artificial intelligence or was this real? You're going to most likely, as an average person, interpret all pieces of information equally. But that's something that's part of the platform, but also part of the way that we interact with platforms. And so when then actors like Elon Musk say that, or Meta say that we're not going to fact check anymore, or we're actually going to permit our technologies to be used in different contexts. We have a responsibility then as citizens of democratic countries to think about what that means for us and what kind of vulnerabilities we then have to face and respond to, because I think, to round off my point, that is part of our democratic responsibility, is to care about what we are consuming, to not just expect the government or these tech companies to hand us everything on a silver platter, but really think, what is this, what does it mean to me, and how can I better perform my duties as a democratic citizen? Yeah.
Thank you. So Dimitri, broadly speaking, in terms of technology and European power, we have two options that are not mutually exclusive. One, reinforcing our own capabilities, and two, creating links for cooperation, investment, and exchange with third countries. So on the first front, how can the EU increase its own domestic capabilities? And on the second front, do we need to increase our tech alliances, for instance, with middle powers beyond the US and China?
Thank you. No, so here it's yet another level. So we have discussed what is the overall goal, achieving technological sovereignty and competitiveness. We have discussed that they are mutually reinforcing, and the link is innovation-based productivity. And we've also said that it's not an easy goal to achieve because there are key trade-offs, especially principle of innovation and principle of precaution. Now we are asking ourselves, how can we achieve this concretely? What is the blueprint? What is the recipe? And which is yet another level in the sense that here I would refer back to the 2021 Strategic Foresight Report of the Commission, which introduced this concept of open strategic autonomy, which I think has shaped a lot of the strategic thinking of Europe, of the European Commission, in the coming years, up to today with the competitiveness compass. What does it mean? It means being as open as possible, as autonomous as necessary, and I think that this makes a lot of sense also in the field of technology and innovation. What Europe needs is what I like to call a new industrial vision focused on open strategic autonomy. It actually links to both the aspects that you mentioned, so domestic capacities and smart technological alliances. This is not new. I would like to give you the example, for instance, of another area on which I've worked in the past, which is a regulation that everybody knows today. It's the Critical Raw Materials Act. Now, we all know it as a regulation today, but the reflection started many years before in the field of foresight. Foresighters started analyzing where Europe was strategically dependent on third countries for specific raw materials that were absolutely needed for the green and the digital transitions, and realized, for instance, that we are dependent, as Europe, 90% for processing and refining and extraction of critical raw materials, and especially rare earths, on China, so the concept of excessive dependencies. And then a strategy was laid out in the 2021 Strategic Foresight Report with three legs. The first one was, in the short term, diversify your partnerships, diversify your alliances, nearshoring, friendshoring, simply because not all endowments are in Europe. We cannot do 100% of our rare earths in Europe because simply we don't have them. Second, in the short to medium term, boost your domestic capacities wherever you can, wherever you have the endowments, and focusing on strategic critical raw material projects. And in the longer term, reduce your demand via, especially for primary critical raw materials, using recycling and secondary use, but also coordination, so joint purchasing of critical raw materials at European level. I think that this paradigm, which has now become a regulation through a complex and long process, is also valid, is also useful in the area of technology and innovation. Europe is certainly trying to boost its domestic capacities in the field of technology, but it's obvious that not everything can be done in Europe technology-wise. Of course, limitations come from financing, limitations come from the industrial and the knowledge base that Europe has. Limitations also come from the global playing field, often unlevel playing field. The colleagues mentioned export restrictions, and you name it. I think the good example is another area that colleagues mentioned, which are chips, semiconductors. The 2022 CHIPS Act was clearly aimed at boosting European domestic capacities, for instance, to have at least some production of microprocessors in Europe by 2030, not certainly an area where Europe is very strong, while we know the US has NVIDIA and many others. Certainly it's positive that the EU CHIPS Act tried to boost these pilot lines for testing and experimenting, for instance, with quantum chips, so also with this technology foresight in mind, with a forward-looking approach. At the same time, the approach was also to develop smart tech alliances, and I think this is a point that in the field of chips is very clear to understand, because the chip market is a very complex and special market where winner-takes-most dynamics are extremely strong. Whoever is good in a certain type of chip does it for the whole world, and it's clear that Europe cannot invest in all types of chips. It doesn't make any economic sense, it doesn't make any strategic sense, and therefore this links to your second part of your question. Europe certainly needs to continue remaining open and have smart tech alliances, for instance, with Southern and East Asia. This is the part of the world that is more specialized in the production of chips, and Europe itself has barely any fab that produces chips below 22 nanometers. So here, it's really open strategic autonomy in its purest sense. A technology strategy and a digital industrial policy focused on open strategic autonomy requires both boosting domestic capacities where it makes economic and strategic sense, and remaining open in a spirit of strategic counterweight, in a spirit of complementarity. I think this is also a key word that was used in the Draghi report, and I want to flag that a key recommendation that was put forward in the Draghi report was also to create this low-barrier digital transatlantic marketplace between the EU and the US, which would lower the barrier and allow more cooperation, actually in line with what Lindsay and Sofia just mentioned, in order to work together more and exchange more in a logic of complementarity. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a good time now to open the discussion to the audience. So we have around 10 minutes. If there are some questions, there's one there. Yes.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Pau Alvarez from the World Bank. And so my question was, so before Biden left office, there was one of the most groundbreaking regulations in export controls, the AI diffusion rule. And one important fact is that there are some countries which were, devoted to Tier 1, with full access. But there were some other EU countries like Poland who were, devoted to Tier 2. So my question is, with these changes in export controls, how does that leave current US-EU cooperation in tech and trade? And, which are the current challenges that transatlantic cooperation would face in this regard? Thanks.
Sure, yeah, I think it's a great question, and probably one of the foreign policy tools I mentioned, that sort of the partner dimension was a key part of the Biden-China tech strategy, where I think we probably could have done a better job of communicating to our allies and partners. That came right in at the end of the administration. But I think it's a couple things. First, it's about developing a shared operating picture, a common operating picture to understand the threat space when it comes to the diffusion of semiconductors, but also other technologies which are on this sort of list for export controls, for outbound investment screening. But there are a few things up in the air right now, I would say. At the AI Action Summit, which our Consulate General mentioned, the Vice President signaled that some of these controls would stay in place, but we don't know exactly what that means yet. And I think it's an opportunity to develop some of that shared understanding. Mm. The second piece is that it's important to keep in mind that these were new regulations. The October 22, it was a combination of tools that hadn't really been used in the same way, in the same place together before. Not just about the entity listing of firms in China, but also about the restrictions on human talent and human capital that could participate in that sale and manufacture. And I don't think we got it totally right on the first blush. And the evidence for that is that there were these chip smuggling regimes be it through Russia, through Central Asia, that have emerged. And on some level, that's maybe inevitable when you're using a new collection of tools together. But I think it also exposed that some of the analytical framework, some of the analytical capacity that we really need to understand how these regulations and how these controls are being effective, where they're failing, just weren't in place. And so I think that's going to be the challenge for the next administration. Can we keep those controls? And to your question on the tier 1 versus the tier 2 countries, what is the concrete basis for a tier 1 or a tier 2? And I would submit that it has to be based on a robust analytical understanding of where we can afford to be more liberal in sharing and not restricting unnecessarily trade and economic activity, so we can build some of these complementarities, and where we need to really tighten the screws. And so I think that is really a great area for concrete transatlantic cooperation. As Dimitri is mentioning, this strategic foresight, and it's not just in semiconductors and chips, it really is across all these technologies, because it doesn't make sense to have everyone running after the same components of the same supply chains. It makes much more sense to have strong champions on different elements of the supply chain, as I think we naturally do. But with what has to be the same is this common understanding of where the technologies are going, both theoretically going in the future, and where they're going practically in the real world as they get shipped across from country to country.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for your interventions. Matthias from Hague City. The other day, Mario Draghi wrote an article in the Financial Times about the internal barriers, not just, it's very fashionable to talk about external barriers and tariffs right now, but the internal barriers in Europe. And he said that when it comes to services, it would amount to like 110% equivalent to a tariff. So my question is, what is the European Commission doing to remove these barriers, to finalize the single market, make sure our innovators in Europe can market their innovations in an easier way? Thank you.
Maybe I can take this one. Yes, I mean this estimate by Professor Draghi is actually comes from the International Monetary Fund, so it's a paper that he quotes, and there is an important analysis. The real meaning of what Professor meant in that article, I think, is the external challenges are proving an occasion for Europe to get its act together and focus on what really matters the most in order to boost its competitiveness, Matthias. And especially what you mentioned, I mean, the need to tackle internal barriers is exactly the meaning of what I focused on at the end of my opening remarks, this new way of working together. I mentioned 5 horizontal enablers. One is coordination, aligning better our policies. One is simplification, which is also very important, but one is also fully reaping the potential and the benefits of the single market, and there are specific flagship initiatives in this area. Another one, super important, is financing competitiveness. I mean, the competitiveness compass is not a financing strategy, but there is a lot about financing in there. There is a lot of focus on private finance, on what was once known as capital market union. Now we call it savings and investments union, but the concept is the same. We need to move this private capital towards financing innovation where it really matters. We need to refocus our public money, refocus the European budget, better use of national budgets, and we need to use public money in order to catalyze private capital, crowding private investment via de-risking, and this means focusing and rethinking the role of the European Investment Bank, for instance, and the European Investment Bank group at large. And the fifth enabler is skills and talent. I don't have to say much about this, but so it's really a comprehensive strategy that responds to this goal. And actually in that article, Professor Mario Draghi mentioned the competitiveness compass, which is the exact follow-up to this call that he says, I mean, let's not focus too much on this trade war. Let's focus really on what we can do in order to become better. And somehow, when the Draghi report was out, indeed, many people feared that this would be like an alarm bell that sounded and then ended up in a drawer. And in the end, I think the compass is the idea we can act on it. We have a plan. We have a will. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. So my name is Javier Borràs, and I would like to ask Mrs. Gorman and Romansky a question. To what extent what you have been describing about the AI race has similarities with the nuclear race, some decades ago? Thank you.
Yeah, you can take that. So in terms of the far-reaching consequences of nuclear and artificial intelligence in terms of the strategic calculations of international actors, they have a lot of similarities. Both nuclear and artificial intelligence have had and continue to have the impact of changing the way that actors think about escalation. I think that's one of the main areas of overlap. So if you think about first strike capabilities, knowing when to hit and where to hit and how, and also responding to that and de-escalating if necessary, those are two things that they share, and that's primarily because artificial intelligence is an enabling technology. So it can itself also be integrated into nuclear decision-making chains. There are a lot of conversations right now in the global governance debate about actually prohibiting that, because arguably the decision to launch a nuclear strike should remain with people for full responsibility, but also to avoid these accidental escalations and perceptions of potential escalation. But there are also key differences, and that relates to one of the points that I made during my opening remark, and that is the development of nuclear technology was a military capacity, whereas the development of artificial intelligence is primarily a private sector capacity, which means that by nature, the technology that is inherently dual use, meaning that it applications that are used in the civilian domain can also be almost directly translated into the military domain, are regulated and guided by different principles. So engineering standards, for example, and the priorities of verification and testing. Because if you are in the military domain, then you have different procurement requirements. So ensuring that any system that you'll be using is reliable, it's governable, and it operates with certainty, or as much certainty as it will allow, is very important. Artificial intelligence is not necessarily that, also because it's very difficult to put nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence in the same category of technologies, because artificial intelligence is a category of technologies in itself. So we really need to think about what specific applications of artificial intelligence are we talking about, and where can these comparisons be drawn. But so there are both similarities and differences that need to be taken into account. I hope that answers your question.
I might just add, if there's time, one similarity and two differences. One similarity is that you have scientists in both of them. My training is in, yes. My training's in quantum physics, and when I moved to DC over a decade ago, you're a physicist, you should do nuclear. Now I think the physicists and the engineers that are moving from Silicon Valley to DC, they're being told you should do AI.
Yep.
But the implications really are, not just a joke, but for science policy and the need to boost our scientific competitiveness are really there. Two quick differences. One, which was already alluded to on dual use, I would actually go as far to say that we do not have dual use regimes that are sufficient to address the current wave of technologies that are so inherently integrated in between civilian and military. And I think in our outbound investment screening regimes, this has really been front and center. How do you control investment into technology when that company that is a civilian investor also has a defense contract in China? It's really impossible. And so that's why we've tried to set up some of these export control frameworks that can recognize and sort of meet where we are. Totally different. The second difference is it is a live debate whether the leading AI models will be open sourced or closed source. This was the thing with DeepSeek. That was an open source model. That was never a question in nuclear. The barrier of technological sophistication and the amount of that is closed is so high comparatively that it does take years to decades for a nation to develop a successful nuclear program. I don't think that will be the case with artificial intelligence, where, as we've seen, these innovations can be copied and replicated, and that barrier simply doesn't exist.
Thank you. Well, we are out of time, but thanks again, all of you, Dimitri, Lindsay, and Sofia. It was a great conversation, and well, and thank you all also.